Hello, scholars. Mr. Long signing on. Today for APUSH history, we're going to be talking about urbanization during the Gilded Age. So we're going to be focusing at ultimately the time period between the end of Reconstruction and the turn to the 20th century. To start with urbanization, there's going to be a profound population shift, not just in size, but also where people are living. For the size, the population is effectively going to double between Reconstruction and the turn of the century, from 40 million to 80 million people. There's a variety of factors for this, such as the settlement of the Western territories and further expansion westward into California. We also have the agricultural revolution is going to occur during this time, paired with the transportation revolution is going to bring more food to more people, therefore allowing larger populations. Urbanization itself is also going to play into the population rise because it's allowing more people to fit into less area. During the same time, population of U.S. cities had tripled. Most of them are going to be lured by industrial jobs at factories. Down at the bottom, we see the way many of the cities during this time period are growing. For example, the most profound one is going to be Chicago, from just over 100,000 people before the Civil War. 40 years later, it's going to be over 1.5 million individuals. So absolutely ridiculous population growth, especially in those Western cities that were more like territories before the Civil War and then are full-blown states by the time we get to the end of the Gilded Age. This is not a trend exclusive to the United States. We also have similar trends happening all around the world. And so you can look at this as part of like a second industrial revolution, where we had the first industrial revolution during the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And this is a continuation of that, allowing more people to fit into less areas. So what developments enabled such growth? I already talked about or briefly touched on agricultural improvements. We're going to talk about that more during the subsequent lesson. But ultimately, we're having more food being grown in less area. And then with transportation, such as railroads and canals, we're able to take the foodstuffs and send it to the cities to feed the people that aren't really growing their own food. And so this relationship and this trade is going to enable population shifts to move towards the cities. We also have skyscrapers. This is kind of a simple one, but instead of, if you think of like a rural area where you have, 1 acre of land and you can only have, so many houses on it, if you can build a skyscraper, let's even just say, 10 stories, now you have 10 times as many family units living in the same amount of space. That's allowing more people to fit into less area. We also have mass transit lines. This bullet emphasizes the transit within the city that allows people to live in one part of the city and then commute to work in another part of the city versus having to walk, like during the beginning of cities like Boston or New York, where you really had to walk everywhere, or ride a carriage or a horse. But now you can get on a subway, you can take trolley lines to get to work, and it makes it easier to live and function in these cities. We also have some nifty developments that are going to make it more appealing to live in the city, such as electricity. Now there's a nightlife where before there really wasn't. People can work during dark hours. You can socialize during dark hours. We also have indoor plumbing. This is going to help a lot with hygiene to make it more sanitary to live in cities. It's easier to bathe. It's easier to get rid of waste in a hygienic way. So there's less disease, and it's not going to be as gross as it was before we have these developments. We also have telephones, fancy technology that's going to help attract some country bumpkins or ruralites to the cities to go see the shiny electricity and the shiny telephones, and also toilets and flush. Very exciting. Immigration is also going to add to this population boom, especially with urbanization. Until the Gilded Age, so up until the 1880s, so right around here, immigrants were mostly from Western Europe or the British Isles. After the 1880s, we start to see more people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. This is going to give rise to places like Little Poland's, Little Italy's. Some of my ancestors personally are Polish, and so they're coming from this part of the world, usually beginning around this time period. For California, we also have large numbers of Chinese immigrants until they were legally excluded by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so this is also going to help shift the cultural blending within the United States, especially in regards to language and customs, where before it was mostly Western European and English speaking. Now we have people speaking Eastern European languages, we have Italian languages and Greek languages coming over and helping to add to that melting pot that is the United States. The graphic up top shows annual immigration rates with a couple key things being highlighted. Anti-Jewish pogroms. A pogrom is pretty much a government sanctioned, it's a way of, I'm trying to think of the right word, but it's a way of like targeting a specific group of people and trying to like drive them out of an area or exterminate them. Kind of like mini holocausts in a way. So the anti-Jewish pogroms, these were more common in Eastern Europe. So this is going to be a push factor, helping to push people out of Eastern Europe that are trying to escape the pogroms. And many of those people are going to immigrate to the United States. So that's going to be a big push factor as people are trying to seek more religious freedom and more acceptance. You also have the Panic of 1893 that we're talking about during this unit. That's going to be create some economic hardship to keep immigration down because people don't want to go to an area that there aren't jobs and there isn't money. But ultimately, you can see that during this period here, during the Gilded Age, immigration is typically higher than it was before. Not as high as it will be before World War I, but still significantly high. Here's a fun cartoon that I found from Puck. It's ultimately picking fun and making fun of the descendants of immigrants who came here to the United States and then turn, as the generations pass, they themselves start to turn against other immigrants. And so you have the wealthy, well-to-do contemporary fella, and then the shadow of either him himself as an immigrant or maybe his ancestor as an immigrant looming behind him, watching kind of with disgust as the contemporary version is, putting up a hand to kind of block, trying to stop a more recent immigrant from coming to the United States and seeking the same opportunities that, these ancestors had themselves. This was a pretty common theme. It still is today. You have a fair amount of nativism where people do not want to accept new immigrants, either because they're afraid of immigrants taking their jobs, or they're anti-American, or they don't speak the language, whatever excuse it may be. And it's easy to forget that for most Americans, it's hard to find some that aren't, unless you're on a Native American reservation, but most Americans were immigrants themselves. And you would think that they would be more understanding of other immigrants coming to have similar opportunities, but it hasn't always been the case. Unless anti-immigrant, nativist mentality and sentiment today is not new for United States history. Here is a photograph of some tenement housing in probably New York City. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, but this should show you two things. One, some of the living conditions of recent immigrants coming over, that they really didn't have a lot of luxury and they really just had to persevere to make it work, but also some of the living conditions in cities. So lots of people living in very close quarters, not overly hygienic, not overly comfortable. In this image alone, you have maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 individuals living in a very small space. There is going to be reform as a reaction to these rough living conditions. It is going to take some time for that to come into effect. Urbanization also is based off of industry. Children were often used in factories because you didn't have to pay them as much. And they had small, nimble fingers that could kind of work the fine-tuned machinery that was used during the time. This is before the time of child labor laws, so it was pretty common for little kids to end up in the factories where sometimes they would lose limbs or their lives in the machinery. And here you have pictures of children pretty much climbing on top of the machines to make sure that they're working correctly. And it wasn't uncommon for fingers or toes to get crushed in the machinery and small children to be maimed, which, there's no workman's comp. So now they're sent home and they're not making any money and they're not as useful economically as they were before. The idea of education reform is going to continue to grow. We talked about that a little bit with the Second Great Awakening before the American Civil War, but that itself is going to continue, especially with immigrants coming over, that people are going to want them to be socialized, to be good Americans, to learn English, and then be productive members of our democracy. The idea of free government school or tax-funded school before the Civil War was focused mostly on primary schools, so like elementary school. After the Civil War, there's going to be a push to expand tax-funded schools at the high school level throughout the country. And so from a couple hundred before the Civil War or during the Civil War to over 6,000 over a 40-year period. This is going to help lower the illiteracy rate, so the amount of people who cannot read and write. It's going to drop from 20% in 1870 to 10% in 1900. So that's having that rate itself. And many adult immigrants, as seen here in this picture at the bottom, many adult immigrants are going to help become Americanized and learn English as a result of their children going to school and learning English and speaking English, and then the children come home and teach the parents, something that we can still see today in some parts of the country. Families and women in the cities. Cities were not a healthy place for families, not just like biologically from disease or malnutrition, but also emotionally not very healthy. And here in Rappahannock County, this is a rural community, so we can understand maybe where some of these people that migrated to the cities were coming from. Cities were crowded, but despite how many people live there, they were emotionally isolated places. Out here in Rappahannock, we have family and friends that will support us if we're going through a tough time, and there's a good sense of community. In cities, especially during this industrial period, you don't really have that. Yes, you may be living in a tenement with neighbors and hundreds of people living in your building, but you don't know them the same way as if you're working on the farm together or going to the co-op together and working together to, build a new barn for somebody. And so you don't have the emotional support. Also, in rural communities, families stayed close. That your parents were born in this town and then you lived in this town and then your children will live in this town, and you don't move a whole lot because you're typically working on farms or in the small towns that supported farms. In the city, when people migrated to the city, they left behind that support network. So if you have a young couple that moves to the city and then they're raising their kids on their own, that's dramatically different than being back on the farm where, grandparents can help out, aunts, uncles, other siblings, older cousins. They can all kind of contribute to raise the family as a healthy unit. The urban era is also going to launch the era of divorce. I'm not going to get too deep into a lot of these causes, but a lot of it gets attributed to the emotional isolation of being alone. Also, you can look at opportunities. If you're in the city and you're a young lady who is unsatisfied with your husband because it's just a deadbeat, good for nothing, there are other men around to catch your eye, and maybe you want to pursue other options. So there's more opportunities in the cities, and pair that with the emotional stress of living in a new austere environment, and you have a recipe for divorce rates increasing. This is also going to change work habits. Husbands, wives, and children often worked typically in factories or in the urban setting. Even on rural communities during this time, kids were put to work on a farm. More children meant more free labor. As a kid, I was doing chores at a young age. I'm sure a lot of my students here, you guys do chores, and yeah, you're not really paid for it. You're just expected to help out around the house. In the cities, however, more children meant just more mouths to feed. So you were really pushed to go out to the factories to make money to help support the family. The graphic on the left here is emphasizing changes in birth rates during this time. So during the 1861 period, you can see that compared to the remainder of the Gilded Age going up until 1900, the average birth rate across the nation is declining, in large part to some of these trends we see here, that people living in cities don't need to have 9 kids to work on the farm the way my dad was one of 9 kids growing up because they had a farm and it was effectively free labor. In the city, you don't have 9 kids most times because you don't have as much space living in your tiny apartment, but you also need to feed all those kids who aren't working the same way as if they would be on a farm unless they get old enough for you to push them out the door to go work in a factory or a mine. Families and women in the cities, marriages and families were delayed. It was often a higher priority in urban communities to have social security or social mobility to move up, as well as economic security and mobility. So people were more focused on being financially and socially independent than breeding. We also have birth control techniques becoming more popular during this time, where women now could control more easily when they have children. And for women that didn't want to have children at a young age because they wanted to be social and economically independent, they don't have to have kids, or they can take more steps to prevent themselves from getting pregnant. Part of this story is that it was common for women in factories to be effectively fired when they became pregnant, because this is still a very patriarchal society, and the perception of women was that once they have a kid, that should be their only priority, and you can't be a working mom during the Gilded Age. People are starting to challenge this idea, but this is still a very old school idea that existed during this Gilded Age. So many women didn't want to get pregnant because if they did, they knew they would lose their job and then would have to be entirely dependent on a man or their husband so that they don't starve to death. So avoiding getting pregnant was appealing for a lot of these urban women. Women were also starting to challenge the idea of being effectively breeders, this Republican motherhood. If you think back to that revolutionary idea after the American Revolution, the idea being that, as a mother, you have a special place in society, raising your kids to be good citizens for the country. Well, women start to see that as kind of an anchor rather than a sail, and they start to challenge the idea that, maybe there's more than just being a good mom, and maybe we're cursed to kind of be secluded in the house just because we're the only ones that can, give birth. Female reformers are starting to advocate for things like nurseries and daycare so that mothers could drop their kids off at a child care place and then go to work themselves. Something that didn't really exist because on the farm, you just either took your kid with you or, you dropped them off at grandma's or the aunts, and there was someone in the community that would kind of take over that child caring role that didn't exist in the same way in cities because they don't have that family structure as broadly as urbanites do. Suffrage movement, women start to apply this concept of Republican motherhood, that if they are responsible for raising their children to be democratic members of societies, then how does it make sense that women themselves cannot vote? That women can't teach how to vote unless they themselves can vote. And there's a logic gap that these women are applying this idea of Republican motherhood to. And so they're linking the ballot to the traditional definition of women's roles, that we need to be able to vote. We being women need to be able to vote so that we can be a part of the society, be a part of the political discussion, so that we can teach our kids, because then we ourselves will be informed. Because this is still a gross time period. Black women were excluded from many of these suffrage groups just purely based off of race. So, can't be all super woke for the time period, but for the historical context, pretty woke for the time. Women met local success when it came to suffrage or the right to vote. On the national level, it's not going to occur until the passage of the 19th Amendment. I think it was like 1919, 1920, right after World War I. But for state and local elections, especially out west, so the further west you go on this map, you can see that more women have the complete right to vote, complete suffrage. And it's interesting to look at this map because you might notice that we kind of have 3 different zones appearing, where on the East Coast, it was very conservative and old school in the sense that, if you go back to the founding, where if you're going to vote, you have to be white, you have to be a man, and you have to own land. So this is a very ingrained concept of who can vote. And it's harder for women to make headway there because they're battling against 100 to 200 years of tradition. Out in the Western territories, we start to get more rights for women to vote, as these are newer territories that really had to be carved out of the landscape, and they needed all hands on deck to make that happen. So not just men being involved in making this work, but also women. And it's more of a fresh, clean slate to establish, hey, let's relook at how we determine who can vote and maybe make it a little more inclusive. And then as, again, you go further west, now you're in the territories where these are the newest states to be added to the union, and so they're the most modern in regards to, you know, starting from scratch. They're not battling 100 years of tradition, or even going back to 1607 in Virginia, where they're battling 250 to 300 years of tradition, and they can have more success there. Wyoming is going to be the first state to grant unrestricted suffrage to women in 1869. So again, we're looking at a more western state here in Wyoming. By 1890, most states had passed laws permitting women to own or control property after marriage, which is, again, giving them more independence, that they don't have to be married to a man to inherit property or control property, that they can do it on their own. So good things happening for women in American society during this time period. So here is our check on learning. Feel free to go back through the video and pinpoint some of these questions. You should be able to find them, if not on the slides themselves, from the mouth noises I was making. First question, what factors enabled increased urbanization? We talked about that towards the beginning. How did urbanization impact American society? You're going to see some snippets of that throughout the slide deck. And finally, how did women use the concept of Republican motherhood to justify women's suffrage? That one's going to be more of a big brain question that I'm going to ask you to, I get you started on some of these ideas and I make some references to it, but feel free to dig a little deeper and put it in your own words. Other than that, I don't have anything else for you. I'm trying to look at the clock to see how long this is. About 20-minute video, a little over. I was trying to keep it brief, but I like to talk, especially about dead people in history. So I'm going to sign off. Let me know if you guys have any questions or comments. Be sure to answer the questions on Canvas, and I will see you guys next time. Mr. Long, over and out.